Yes, I do want to live long enough to enjoy sailing. I must say I spent 2.5 weeks trying to enjoy sailing a little earlier this year, and I fully intend to have another go. And I promise next time I will take enough drugs with me so that throwing up is not the inevitable outcome of a wave, just one wave, a single wave, and I was not very good at it. But I loved the whole thing of a control freak perfectionist absolutely having to stop being a control freak and a perfectionist, let someone else who knew what they were doing actually do it, and then hanging on for dear life while I learned not to do a thing. It was a very, very good life lesson. And I can recommend it to everyone who's a control freak. Let go. Go sailing. So why am I here? Because I've been talking to, and thank you, Mr. Intellectual Heritage up the back, who didn't quite like that statement. I want to thank Gerard Hastings in particular for sparking this idea and slide number 1. And I also want to thank Alan Tapp for not sparking the idea but helping with the furtherance of it. And Alan's already spoken about my hero, Brennan. And that story started me off on where I'm about to take you. So I would like to talk about systemic change. And we've heard over the last day and a half people talking about things that happen. And I will admit that I'm a professor of advertising, and I'm actually really good at that. I know how to manipulate people into doing things they don't necessarily want to do, or things that are not necessarily good for them. I actually became a professor at the time that I was asked to brief on how to get 13 to 16-year-old young girls to take up smoking. At that time, I went home to my husband and I said, I don't work in the advertising industry anymore. And the reason for that was because I had a 10-year-old daughter at home. And I thought to myself, how do I protect her from this system which is designed to actually prevent me from doing the best I can to help her in her life? So I actually started thinking then, it's not about the advertising, hence the statement about the abuse and the use of advertising. And I have worked on this over a long time, and it is not just my idea, but it all starts, if you want systemic change, it starts with your perspective on power. And I'm going to start, despite the fact that you can read it from left to right, I'm going to start on the right-hand side, because that is where most social marketing, advocacy and advertising sits. It sits at the intervention therapy end. So what I'm going to do is sell you something that's good for you. And I'm going to do that because I think you need it. I don't want you smoking yourself to death, and no one does, but the fact is I'm going to tell you to do something. And that's where we all start, but it is actually manipulation. And advertisers are very good at manipulating. And it is coercion because it's involuntary. I'm actually asking people to do things that they don't want to do. And I have no issues whatsoever if, as social marketers, we know that that's what we're doing. If we are going to coerce somebody and we're going to manipulate them, then we have to be honest with ourselves that that's what we're doing. Because the toolkit that we use is then affected by that. And it is at the people, not for the people or by the people. Thank you very much for your presentation this morning, because you're absolutely over here. You're here. You're actually doing what citizens want to do for the citizenry, for their communities, for the people. And they're engaged in that process that actually means that what happens is sustainable and profitable for all. Not the person who says stop, but the persons who get together to say this is how we can. And that shifts the dynamic of what you're trying to achieve significantly. And you see a lot of tokenism as well, which is in the middle ground here. It's not really in the middle ground, it's a separate column all by itself. And that's a language of appeasement. That is when I want you to think I'm doing the right thing. I want you to hear that I've heard you, but I don't actually intend to change anything I'm doing as a result of that. I'm just appeasing you. And so that language matters, and we've talked about that, getting it to the audience in the audience's words. I want to ask you how far you think you can go when the rhetoric is battle and war. I'm going to coerce you, I'm going to manipulate you, I'm going to make you change. Versus, let's do this together. And the other thing about it, we seem to have flipped somewhere over the last 15 years into a space where we just keep throwing more and more and more money at the problem. And the fact is, if the communities are engaged in solving the problem for themselves, by themselves, with support, you can get it down to $2.80 a tonne. It's cheaper to work with the people than it is to buy a bigger billboard or have 3 million readers who are just going, no, I'm not watching that. And those sorts of things are where we've got it wrong as social marketers. We think we need more money, but we don't. We need more engagement with people solving their problems, not our problems, their problems. And that's what we've got ourselves into, is this, what I call bifurcated trench warfare. We actually are throwing ideas at each other without understanding how those ideas can be picked up and engaged with, and we can move forward as a group of people. So it all starts with your position on power. Yes, there is a lot of corporate power. Yes, there's a lot of monetary power. Yes, there's a lot of people power. And trust me, people power is bigger and better than any of those other things. The world has changed many times in the last, how many thousand years are we talking about, Alan? 6,000 years. And each time it's changed, it has been because consumers didn't like it the way it was. And it can be changed in that way again. So one of the things I think social marketing has got itself into is what I call the search for the one right answer. And anyone who's had a child go through high school understands what that means. Everyone wants to sit that exam and get a perfect score at the end. So what we do is we teach you that there are perfect answers in order to do that. And when we're talking about systemic change, we're actually competing priorities where there are many perfect answers, and the person who's starting this process is not the perfect solution. But we've already had people talking about start with the solution. But there is a desperate desire for somebody to be right. We would really like somebody to be right. The chain of evidence that Alan projected this morning has expert power at the top when it comes to that, but it also has random controlled trials. I don't know about you, last time I was cooking something, I couldn't do a random controlled trial. I couldn't figure out whether or not this piece of chemistry, was that flour old enough? Should I actually use hard flour or soft flour, or is my baking powder out of date? They're the sorts of things where there are times where life intervenes and a random controlled trial is actually not feasible, despite the fact that it's a beautiful benchmark of evidence. So we stop doing things because the evidence doesn't help us decide. So what happens is we do nothing rather than do something that might take us forward. It may be an anecdote and we may be able to use that to move forward, but if we wait for the evidence to catch up, sometimes we're just not going to make it at all. The other thing I think goes wrong, and I've got a couple of examples of this that I'm going to click over, is what I call bivariates and linear thinking. We would like the world to be a bivariate place. We would like somebody, if this, then that, to work every time. Unfortunately, it doesn't, because if this, then something else happened and life intervened, especially when we're talking about social marketing, when life intervenes in everything they do. I also want to talk about myths and legends. When it comes to freedom and choices, we think we're free. And Australia particularly uses a free choice environment in terms of its thinking, especially about public policy. We make a baseline assumption that everybody can make a choice. And I'm not convinced that that's true. thinking about year 12 and getting there, did that child who's sitting there doing or not doing the exam, and my son sat on the couch playing games, thank you, Timo, for year 12. And the direct outcome of that was he got exactly what he needed to get into the course that he wanted. But that was the most stressful 4 weeks of my life, because I thought he had managed to sit year 12 on the couch. But he understood the importance of being entertained. He didn't make any choices about which school he went to, which primary school he went to. He did make a few choices about which courses he studied. But when it comes to that choice of university, was he really making that choice? No, that was a lifetime decision. That was something that took 18 years to get to. And you can't talk about choices outside their cultural, economic and social context. Hence, I've become a systems thinker, because it isn't the choice being made in the supermarket, it's the life that goes with it. So I think we actually get ourselves into this mythology of free choice, which is why we keep advertising it. People, choose me, pick me, pick me. And the fact is, they only might pick you if on a good day they feel like it. Hacking is real, and so is artificial intelligence, and what that means is our basis for evidence is actually substantially wrong. And we need to be really careful about what it is we're reading. And how do I know this? Is because I actually have a PhD student too, PhD, one just finished, working in cybersecurity. And they can hack into anything and change the results. And in order to figure out whether that was true or not, they did their PhDs by hacking and changing results. Please, always triple check your evidence base. And artificial intelligence is real, and that chatbot is real. And can that help? Yes, but please check your evidence base before you go there. Understand the system that is set up around those things, and that there are competing interests in those spaces. Big data doesn't provide solutions, and we provide solutions. As practitioners, we provide solutions, but also our communities provide solutions, and they're the ones who are smarter than we are, and we have to let go. We actually have to go to our communities and ask them for their solutions if we want to be successful and sustainable over time. I also talk about gambler's fallacy, because what I've seen, and thank you to whoever it was yesterday who put up the National Social Marketing Benchmark criteria, is what I've seen is that we keep relying on those benchmarks and those criteria. What we come up with is, oh, it must be good because it's been done before. And the direct outcome of that is we're feeding into our own rhetoric about success, which is that if it was done before, it must have been good. How about if it worked? And I don't know about you, but as a consultant, before I escaped to academia where I wasn't hung up on objectives, if the client didn't like the objective, we fixed the objective. You know, we didn't fix the world. We changed the objective. And I remember falling out of love with my consultancy career when my client said, but we got 800% more than we thought we would. That's good. And I've gone, so why is that good? You didn't have any stock. You had all these unhappy customers. And he said, oh, because it's bigger, it must be better. And as a girl, I know that's not a good answer. Despite what Penny said yesterday. So we're caught up in our own rhetoric, and we need to fix some of that stuff. Random controlled trials in human beings. And I'm very grateful for Sharon, or whoever the reviewer was, for letting me get away with the line in my paper which said human beings don't operate well in petri dishes. Because it's true. You can't shove the world into the petri dish long enough to make it work. And how I say that is, I can't make the world stop long enough to codify it. I can't. A rapidly changing space. And when we're trying to do that random controlled trial, linear thinking, bivariate stuff, we're trying to codify a world. And we're trying to codify a big world. And it's very, very difficult to do that. The other thing I want to make a point about is what I call facts, factoids, fanatics and fundamentalism. And the facts are facts. I'm not going to argue with what a fact is because we've got some science, and Alan put up his triangle this morning. Note there are two different shapes to that triangle depending on who you're trying to persuade. So they're facts, but there are factoids as well. And when we've got AI and big data, there are more factoids out there than there are facts. And we need to not buy into what those are, and they exist. And we need to, as social marketers, not try to overcome factoids, but to be aware that the people we're trying to persuade, if that's what we're doing, will have those factoids very tightly held in their hearts. And we are not going to be able to do open heart surgery to get them out of their hearts. The other thing is we have fanatics and fundamentalism. The louder you shout at someone, a la spending more money on your advertising campaign, the more likely you are to turn them into a fanatic or a fundamentalist. And you will not get them out of that position in order to be advocates for your work or advocates for a good idea. If you do push people too hard and you shout at them too loudly, then what you do is kick in self-protection motivation, and the direct outcome of that is that they will stop listening to you, they will start putting on their glasses so they can't see your billboard, or they'll start catching alternative forms of transport so they can't swipe this ad. So, systems thinking. There are many, many metaphors for systems thinking, and I've got this deliberately messy so you can't focus on it. And the reason is I just want to make a point here is that when you read about systems thinking, there isn't one worldview on what that means. There are ecological systems, there are biological systems, there are technological systems. Leighton, for example, one of my heroes in marketing, actually uses an engineering and an operations systems paradigm. Brennan, who is a psychologist, I checked. Brennan, who's in this middle one, was a psychologist who used a biological metaphor, and each one of those metaphors actually has a different set of principles underpinning it. So if you're going to use an engineering metaphor, which you might be more comfortable with if you're a marketer, mainstream marketer, then it will be a whole series of bivariate causal links. If you're using a Brennan metaphor, then there is no causation, it just is. So that actually sets your perspective on what you're trying to achieve. If you're going to build a strategy using systems, then what you need to do is understand which strategy you're doing. I would not recommend Leighton because I don't know about you, I have never managed to figure out what the causal links are in the obesity map. I do want to point something out though, which is, in case any of you are enjoying using this obesity map is, from an academic's perspective, what we call a dog's breakfast. And the thing is, what I really love about our dog's breakfast is that it's not a map at all. It's actually a bunch of independent, different research paradigms. It's got nothing to do with humans. What's wrong with that story? If I'm trying to fix obesity, I should at least be able to go, if this, then that. But of course, we've got physical activity environment over here. Thank goodness we recognise there's an environment. And then over here, we've got food consumption. And we know that food consumption and physical activity have something to do with each other, but it just goes around and around. And now what do? I'm a social marketer. I've got to be able to fix this. So the first thing I'm going to do as a social marketer is try to fix it by lining things up. This was an attempt, which has been published, to fix the alcohol consumption ecosystem problem. I have since decided it's unfixable. So I'm not going there anymore. But it reads from left to right, thank you very much. It does have recognition of Brennan. There are macro, exo, meso and micro things. It ends with behaviours because that's what we're trying to fix. We're trying to fix behaviours. But what we discovered in doing this map of things was that all of these people mess with the system. So here we have mass media, which is not advertising. Over here is people's response to marketing forces, that is advertising and other things. But then we have our public policy over here, and we have a lot of public policy work in Australia, but the public policy is in no way connected to people's belief systems and so on and so forth. So in putting that map together, we at least identified the people who should be working together if they have a problem to fix. So public policy needs to be working with issue policy. This is where I fell out of love with this process. I discovered that in Australia, you can feed your 2-year-old straight vodka if you want to. There isn't an age limit there. And I went, why isn't there a law against that? Oh, because we don't need one. Why don't we need one when we have a law against everything else? And realised that the public policy people didn't want to talk to the issue policy people because they couldn't, which is where this came down to, come up with an enforcement framework. How can we enforce that? Should not be a reason to have a law. So in terms of secondary supply, feeding your 2-year-old alcohol is still allowed. And there should be a few things that change in the middle of that. So all of these things make an effort. The bit that hurts me as a social marketer is the amount of money that goes here. We spend vast amounts of money. Something like $60 million a year gets spent on stopping people from drinking too much alcohol. And it's not working. If it was working, then there would be a reason to do it. If we took that $60 million and put it somewhere else, we might end up with a cleaner, neater system. And I'm sorry to try and line it up. It doesn't line up, but it just helped me as a control perfectionist to try and put some boxes on the page and make them go left to right. Instead of, which is the other point I wanted to make, instead of putting the poor individual at the centre of all of the social pressures that exist, which is what we currently do in social marketing. So, a toolkit. This is what has come out of this work. A toolkit for social behaviour change. What I wanted to do was to point out that we need to connect those systems. We need to map them, but not worry too much about codifying, just a bit of mapping, a bit of get out your mind mapping software, and please don't do something like that obesity map. Interconnection between system elements. Recognise, and there were no lines on my map because I didn't want to put them on there because then it just gets like the obesity map. Feed back and feed forward between interconnected elements. Make the decision about what that interconnection is and look at what is called the value proposition. What's in it for you? What's in it for you? And how can we work together to make sure that we both get something out of it? So yes, that's still bivariate, but you still would have more stakeholders doing it. Circularity, construction and destruction of value, thinking about what that is. Synthesis and co-creation. I don't use the word co-production because you're not producing anything, but you are creating a new system, a new way of being. Coexistence, equilibrium and harmony, or peace, maybe, hopefully. Because what happens if you don't set up a harmonious system is that the tensions, particularly the commercial tensions, will end up finding their own harmony and overweighting the good that you're doing with your community. So you need to be careful that what you do has mutual value for all of the participants, or the person with the most power, the participant with the most power, will just get their power back. It has to work for everybody. Bearing in mind that all of them, there are participants and actions and interactions and so on. So individual level is micro, and the point here is that you've got to develop what I call behavioural infrastructure. That's okay then, not just advertising, but the infrastructure in which people can behave. If anyone needs subtitles for these things, it's in my book, Social Marketing and Behaviour Change, and there's a whole chapter around that, but I don't think we need to go in that. Just that this is the model you would use to be developing behavioural infrastructure, helping people behave. At the meso micro level, it's smaller scale collaborations and you're developing social infrastructure, the community hall, the sorts of things that you're doing to get people together, to talk together, to be together, to challenge each other's thinking and to participate in decision making. Sometimes that means getting permissions to do that. Timo and Sharon's work in communities and schools is classic indication of working at the right level to ensure that that social space is created. If you're working at the community level, this is a communication for development model, that's a model that you would use, but you're looking at multiple stakeholders at various levels across things. The important thing on here is that arrow that talks about what we call bidirectional influences. Each layer or level of a system affects the other layers and levels. So it is possible to get community-led change. It is possible to get top-down change, but not if you don't get buy-in of the various stakeholders along the way. So here, in this level, you're developing what's called collaborative infrastructure. And then finally, this is the one where none of us get to play because we're not governments. However, here you would be developing geopolitical infrastructure. And sometimes, as social marketers, we do want to change the world. And that's when we start to get involved in the World Health Organization, the UN, and those sorts of organisations that can give us that. But bearing in mind that they're policy setters and don't have any enforcement thing, you're still going to have to work with communities at some level. So, EXO would be developing, insulating, mitigating, facilitating infrastructure. And the EXO is the bit that goes outside, it's the shell. We don't get to do anything with EXO, it just is. And for example, climate change is part of our EXO environment, and we don't have any capacity to affect climate change, but we can affect our own individual behaviours, and that won't affect climate change in the short term. However, that's not to say that we should all go out and trash the environment because it's all too late now, because it's not. We're into mitigation now. So historical, social and cultural changes and so on. Now, I have got a toolkit, and I'm just going to slip through these slides because this toolkit has been written about. But what I want to say is to point out that at each individual level, at each level of that Bronfenbrenner's cycle are different tools. This next set of slides, which I promise will only take a couple of minutes, comes about as a result of us establishing what goes wrong in social marketing interventions. And what we established was that if you have an intervention that does the wrong thing, uses the wrong tool at the wrong level, you will fail. So we can actually tell you why you fail now. So individual tools are these things. These are the things we tend to use a lot because they're sexy and they're fun and the ad agency likes to do them. Then if you're going to do the local level tools, which is the meso macro, then you would use things like freemiums and giveaways, training and education, resource development, which is what you're doing, sales promotion, street marketing, participatory action, so on. Then if you're using the outer layer, which is the community level tools, it would be things like strategic partnerships and alliances, conferences, exhibitions, consultations and meetings, because that's the sort of thing you need to do to connect those communities to each other and to your message and to the social marketing strategy. On the outer layer are things like methodological and project support, task force participation, technical assistance, financial assistance. And I'm going to give an example of where financial assistance has actually worked at changing geopolitical infrastructure. Bill Gates wanted to stop female genital mutilation in Eritrea. He simply paid them to change the law. So they changed the law. And then they started a social marketing campaign following that to inform people that the law had changed and the practices had changed. And he knew that it would not happen without the law being changed. So technical and financial assistance is sometimes necessary to go through how we're doing it, but don't tackle the problem at the top if you actually should be working in the middle. And that's where it goes wrong. If we try to use advertising to change government behaviours, we're actually in the wrong space, and we need to be thinking more cleverly about what our toolkit is to be able to create systemic change. You don't need all of them because you've got bidirectional influences. You can actually use one to affect the other. But as a professor of advertising, I have to tell you, advertising is not the solution to a social marketing problem or a social issue. And on that note, I'm done. Thank you very much.